morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to CG seminar number 239 and almost the 100th in the webinar format. Really good to have people coming in for this discussion on this novel topic for us in the UK of Brexit and its effects. I suspect that, for those of us in the UK still trying to deal with this self-inflicted wound, it's something where, that we're very aware of, whereas the rest of the world may have got somewhat tired of it. But it is important to acknowledge that Brexit has major implications for the student flows from the rest of Europe into the UK, as well as the flows out from the UK, because the UK is no longer participating in the Erasmus scheme. And if the students from the rest of Europe don't go to UK, they will go somewhere else for their mobile experiences. So it has lots of flow-on effects on other parts of the world as well, and of course has implications for students in the non-UK parts of Europe themselves. So to tell us about what's happening with student flows and why, we've got with us today Vassiliki Papatsiba, most valued colleague, a research colleague of ours in the Centre for Global Higher Education. Before I introduce Vassiliki properly, can I take you through the webinar protocols? Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website within 24, 48 hours. It goes onto YouTube, and the YouTube take-up of our webinars is somewhat greater than the face-to-face take-up now. So and they, of course, are on YouTube for the foreseeable future. So it's quite a resource there, well worth having a look at what's up there. And today's webinar will be joining the others soon. A transcript of the chat function will be also posted on our website. So that discussion, which is often very valuable, and people go into detail, make statements, ask questions, and comment on each other's postings, well worth keeping as well. Now, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. And there's no need to have your video on either during the webinar, but we advise you to turn it on when you ask your question. I think it makes it better for everyone if you can do that. We recommend using the speaker view setting in Zoom so you can more clearly who's talking at a given time. To ask a question, use the chat function, develop your question or your statement, which will be live after the speaker finishes the main presentation, by writing it out in the chat, and I will select the Q&A participants on the basis of what's appearing in the chat. It's a good idea to come in early. We have this almost every time, we have this pattern of people holding back. The initial questions are slow, and then people come in towards the end, but stimulated by the discussion with lots of good ideas. But try to anticipate the process a little earlier and come in early, and then you will get a presence in the Q&A for sure. Now, when you're invited to ask your question or make your statement, please unmute yourself, a most important step, which I forget about once a week. Then switch on your video if you can, and state your name and where you are from, and then launch into your question or statement. So let me now introduce Vassiliki. Vassiliki's a researcher at University of Sheffield, and currently leads the higher education research cluster there. She serves on the steering group of the Global Challenges in Higher Education and Research of the World Universities Network, which is one of the major international consortia. And she leads the OECD's review of knowledge exchange in Lithuania. She was on the Research Management Committee of CG 2018 to 2020 and remains an active researcher in the centre. So a warm welcome, Vassiliki. We look forward to your presentation and to the discussion immediately after that. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you so much for the invitation to discuss Brexit again. And it is my pleasure to be here. And I would like to thank everyone who made the time. And actually, I think you're all brave souls after 4 years of relentless negative sort of discussions around Brexit, you are still around, you are still interested. I would say that maybe I should also thank the lorry drivers for making Brexit coming back to the fore again, and for those who thought that higher education is completely disconnected from society. I don't think that's the case, and I thought that now we're seeing some tangible effects of Brexit. It's not only Brexit, there is a pandemic, but we are at this phase where there are some more material implications. So I will start sharing my slides for today. We just tried it a few seconds ago, and it seemed, here it is, seemed to be working well. So slideshow from the beginning. So, excuse me. So the title of the presentation today is Less Attractive UK Higher Education to EU Students. So what I'd like to say is that there is a declining EU student, the enrolments, EU student enrolments post-Brexit are declining, and it is no longer we're no longer in the area of prediction. It is about facts, and we saw that the UCAS data as of the 30th of June 2021 stated that it will be about a 44% of drop in EU student applications. We had some more recent UCAS data, and there we had a 56.4% drop in EU student undergraduate admissions. We will have the final data in a week's time. But these are what the statistics showed during the earlier cutoff points. And sorry, I need to hide something here. So this is a direct consequence of Brexit, and it is having destabilizing effects on individual study programs and academic units. But there are also ramifications likely to run deep within the system. For example, it will affect aspects of student experience for common international students, this affecting the higher education sector's reputation, and so on. So I think the drop of EU students in the UK, it is a notable effect or consequence as such in its own right, but most importantly, it intersects with research culture, performance, quality, as well as the UK's attractiveness to UK researchers and academics. So there are distinct, but there are at the same time, there are also compounding effects that are not limited to the immediate quantitative change in student numbers and institutional finances. To discuss those effects, as I said, distinct and compounding, I will draw from a large-scale qualitative study that was undertaken in 2017-2019. And that study has both the scope and depth to provide an authentic insight into the phenomenon and also a trustworthy assessment of the myriad impacts that lie beneath and extend beyond numeric indicators. A quick slide with some information about the project. It is a project that we undertook with CGHE a couple of years ago. Simon Margison was a principal investigator, and for those who would like to have more information, I have included the link. You will find the description of the project on CG's website. And we conducted 12 case studies of 12 diverse UK institutions, universities in the 4 nations. Most of the fieldwork took place in 2018. We got permission to name the institutions where appropriate. So in this slide, it is appropriate to name them. the institutions in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And in total, we conducted 127 semi-structured interviews with predominantly institutional leaders, senior executives, administrators, academics, with some student governing council representatives. So the raw material represents approximately 500,000 words or 1,200 pages of single-space text. A decrease in EU student demand for higher education places was foreseen by nearly all participants, 127 in our research. And I think this unanimity and the senior roles of the majority of our participants begs further interrogation. It is important to examine the views, the projections, the concerns, the mitigating approaches taken by people with such notable institutional responsibilities and experience of the sector. Here we have a word cloud. It shows that students was, quantitatively speaking, an important topic on par with research. So why focusing the analysis that I will present now is specifically on EU students. So why focusing on EU students? First of all, as I showed in the previous slide, students were quantitatively important based on the number of references. But Brexit directly affects the status of EU students with the introduction of international student fees, the discontinuation of their access to the UK student loan system, visa requirements for migration following the end of freedom of movement. European students is a distinctive demographic. However, their specific circumstances have rarely been considered. They partly share with other international students similar cultural experiences of living and studying in a different country. However, they enjoyed similar rights to those of UK students during UK's EU membership that conferred a degree of security, protection, but also agency to exercise these rights, leading potentially to higher degrees and levels of inclusion in the whole society. So Brexit affects directly their status. So in the data sets, how we proceeded. For the analysis, we use an NVivo for the coding, and the node around with EU students was included in the topic implications and consequences of Brexit. We had 3 subnodes that were dedicated to students, EU students, non-EU international students, and UK students. In this presentation, I will only use the data that we had about EU students, and that node in isolation contained more than 50,000 words of text, roughly 10% of the greater data set. And importantly, all 127 participants refer to EU students. The EU students node was further analyzed following a process of inductive coding. So a quick presentation of who were our participants. We had 44 senior executives, 42 academic leaders, 23 senior administrators, 10 participants from governing bodies, and 8 students. Right, so now I will dwell into the findings, so about the role of EU students and how these were represented in the discussions that we had with our participants. So there are broadly 3 main themes that have emerged. So EU student numbers, diversity, competition. So excuse me, I will briefly explain. There was an unanimous prediction of a drop in applicant numbers. In parallel, there was a concomitant fear of a fall in national and cultural diversity of students attending universities across the UK. And finally, there was anticipation of intensified competition for EU students and other resources amid the changing circumstances of the sector. So some further quantitative information. We had EU student numbers was the primary concern raised by institutional leaders and senior academics and implications for income. And all 127 participants referred to EU student numbers. Diversity. So the impending threat to student diversity was the second most dominant concern. The potential loss of EU students remained undesirable regardless of income concerns. So we had 83 of our 127 participants who referred to diversity. Finally, the third theme was competition. As I said earlier, an anticipation of intensification of competition. And we had 72 participants who discussed competition outlook. Excuse me. So everyone predicted that the numbers will drop, EU student numbers. Why that drop was on the cards? Well, simply our participants saw that there is a disincentive, the bureaucratic processes, getting visas, the newly introduced economic obstacles, for example, fees, no accesses to loans, are going to slow down or prevent students from coming. But in addition to these very concrete material circumstances, structural circumstances, they also felt that Brexit has sent out an unwelcoming message and that students would hold off on studying in the UK due to the creation of this hostile environment. They also felt that the various disruptions to different forms of EU involvement will have a concomitant impact on EU student enrolments. So, and here we have something around academic environments that is interesting. And I think there isn't enough awareness, at least in the policy arena, of all these feedback loop effects. So, for example, they mentioned fewer EU academics and researchers coming to the UK that will drive down the organic growth of EU students. The diminished participation, collaboration, and research networks, the UK becoming more inward-looking, isolationist. And finally, the disruptions in student exchanges and Erasmus mobility. So here I have, I'm going to check time to make sure that, sorry, it's 20. So I will not go through the quotes because I will not have the time, but the slides will be available on CG's website later, so you will be able to go back should you wish to have the detail from the quotes. So then the question is the reduced EU student numbers posing an existential threat to financial institutional viability? So what was interesting to see was that the senior leaders found themselves confronting the scale of the threat to their institutions. So they examined whether or not the danger could be considered existential. And so they use that word existential. So there are institutions where these things are existential. If you're an institution, you know this rough figure that about a third of British universities have lost about 20% upwards of their UK student numbers since 2013. So you've got this happening. You fill your boots with EU students. So you Excuse me. So you can perceive here the connotation of institutions being greedy, actually, and taking more than what they needed to. So there was that perception. And there was discussion of, will there be any sector shrinkage, universities going under, closure of a large number of universities. So there was that anxiety around universities disappearing, and whether the government would take action to prevent universities from going bust. So this is to say that UK universities contemplate and appraise changes in size and shape through the lens of financial viability. So I presume most of you are familiar with the UK higher education sector, that here there was a question that they were asking themselves. Will reduced EU numbers cause such a disruption? Will there be business failure somewhere? So the majority of our participants did not anticipate their institution to experience a substantial loss of income. But we had those reports that they have heard from other universities. Anecdotally, that would be extremely difficult for them. It was intriguing as to why only a small minority expanded on the reasons. So less students paying higher fees either mitigates income loss or presents an opportunity to make money. And the calculation that I think 2 or 3 participants only shared was that I think our international fees are double, so it's half the numbers of students, and therefore that should even out. So that's a net off, as they say here. So that was the calculation, but they were quite reluctant to share that statement. So it was also interesting to see that prevalence of an institution-wide view. In a sense, participants, because probably we have selected, also the institutional participants from the institutional leadership team. So they did show, express more allegiance to the university as a whole. They did recognize that the changes in student demographics wouldn't necessarily impact on particular academic departments, but they mentioned restructuring, but often in an impassive way and without giving a lot of explanation in the interviews. The institutional, so in contrast to that institutional leadership's bird's eye view, we had staff members closer to who said boots on the ground. They were more concerned with the risk to individual departments, and the anxiety was more palpable. We didn't, participants refer to a broad range of subjects, and that indicates that no subject area is categorically immune from those changes. And it does depend on the particular subject makeup of each institution. Participants related the viability. When we drilled down to the threat to the programs, we saw the importance of student demand. So some admitted some programs may not be sustainable anymore, or for us as a business, we might have to change quite fundamentally what we do as a university because the students' demographics will change and what they will want to study will change. So this highlights things that we have already seen in the literature, the power of student demand and preferences within the UK higher education, and the framing of students as customers of higher education. There wasn't, we know that shifts in student demand have the potential to facilitate or impede knowledge diversification and disciplinary growth. And here we had some participants who feared that courses with an international orientation could decline, as there wouldn't be the same demand from UK students. And that could also become a disincentive for overseas students to seek out education in the UK. And then home student experience and choice will be affected as a result of programs discontinuing. The reduced, there was an interesting observation that there was some sort of organic growth taking place over the years that resulted from the broader EU engagement. So the healthy or the growing EU student enrolments in the past was attributed to the parallel growth of European professional networks and collaborations driven by EU staff. And so the other theme, that was the biggest theme. As I said, all 127 participants discussed student numbers through the lenses that I presented earlier. So the second theme was about diversity. So one of the aspects was that we had 83 participants speaking about EU students and diversity, and there were no directed questions on student diversity as part of the research design. So diversity was frequently characterized as a defining institutional characteristic fundamental to what a university is and does. Having a diverse campus with loads of different people from different places is just our basic sense of what a good international university should be. And European students have always been a significant part of our being. It's not just about our growth, it's about our being as a university. Several participants described their institution by that sort of feel, the international atmosphere of the campus, lamenting how the university would be worse off without the visible diversity, or audible, because sometimes it cannot be visible, the audible, the different accents, they recognize as an integral part of their university's identity. And there was a sense that diversity, they value diversity, even when they recognize that there won't be necessarily an impact, detrimental effect on income. They recognize that diversity was under threat. This is how they conceptualized it. When they talked about difference, they used the vocabulary of diversity, which is quite common in the UK, but also other Anglo-Saxon higher education systems. So the benefit for us is obviously both in terms of student numbers, someone here recognizes, but actually it's much bigger than that. It's the cultural, the richness that students from Europe bring, hopefully, and it's an exchange richness. So we would be rich with, poor without. And there was that widespread concern that the UK would become more cut off, isolated and insular. And there was also a concern that a fall in EU student numbers from a wide variety of nations would be replaced by international students from a significantly narrower range of geographies, lowering student diversity in the sector despite a possible increase in non-UK applicants. But diversity wasn't only about student experience, it was also used as an accolade and selling point. Many highlighted that having a more diverse student body was a recognized status symbol, accolade denoting quality and international reach. A global university wants to interact globally, wants to be seen to be open. We want a diverse international student population. And in some cases, there was also an acknowledgement that projecting diversity was a marketable asset. It makes us outward looking, and I would say much more attractive as an institution. It's a big pool for students and academics. Finally, diversity had also this dimension of being an intrinsic good for students. Uh, the experience of students will be a bit more insular than it was. So the student experience will be changed and will be enriched as a consequence of that. So the vocabulary around enrichment was very, very strong. So diversity is a benefit to home students, particularly disadvantaged home students, as an ongoing mechanism for cultural exchange, as a rare chance for home students to experience other cultures and to interact with people from Europe, to develop as people, to become good citizens. It was also seen as a benefit to non-UK international EU or EU students, a chance to participate in a globally engaged institution, and finally an enrichment of student personal relationships and networks, developing friendships, wider cultural social networks. The final theme, so we have, I think, 3 more slides. We had 72 participants who referred directly to how competition for EU students or places left behind by EU students would impact on their institution or the wider sector. So there was an acknowledgement that the effects are going to be different or have differential impacts on institutions depending on their relative position within the established hierarchy of UK higher education. We had a continual vertical comparison within the hierarchy of UK higher education. Oxbridge compared to Russell Group, and then post-92, etc. Oxford and Cambridge widely seen as untouchable, totally immune from negative impacts. We didn't have participants from those universities, but this is how other participants referred to Oxford and Cambridge. And London was picked out as the powerhouse of the UK, being in London is a massive competitive asset. And those in London universities are unlikely to go under the radar on the world stage. We also had some smaller size, medium or small size institutions. However, they felt that their reputation and their specific, their niche of subject offerings can protect them from negative impacts. So they highlighted their unique subject provision, but also the fact that they were highly reputable. And many institutions had optimistic strategies to attempt to counteract the fall in student numbers through bursaries and scholarships, T&E activities, more aggressive strategic partnerships, etc., etc. And generally, within that theme of competition, we have that sort of a polarization between the winners and losers. There was a widespread perception that the more deleterious effects would be felt in lower ranked, less prestigious institutions. And there was discussion of quality, and participants felt that there may be a shift in quality across the sector as the decline of EU students open up small places for the best home and international students at universities higher up the traditional hierarchy. There was also horizontal comparison with mainland institutions, especially as more mainland EU universities opt to deliver provision in English. The dominance of the English language as global lingua franca and science was a source of reassurance for institutions across the sector. That at the same time, there was a widespread doubt about what would motivate EU students to study in the UK if faced with higher fees and mobility constraints. There was a sentiment that the UK would retain attractiveness as a cultural destination, but also its presence as a research dominant nation would subside over the following decades. The UK becoming somewhere anyone would love to go, great paths, but you're not likely to find anything really happening. So Concluding statements. So Brexit does represent a major disruption to that ecosystem, the higher education ecosystem, with far-reaching consequences that we can attribute to anticipated sort of separate effects, but they're also overlapping elements that compound on one another. They spill over and they become indistinct. There is a possible, we have experienced that, a possible risk of these issues exposed by Brexit being again obfuscated by the impact of the global pandemic. And the Brexit has become at the same time an instigating factor motivating deeper interrogation of pre-Brexit issues, some deeply ingrained and some newly emergent. So here in these quotes, you will see that our participant said Brexit is only one facet, and it was just Brexit becoming the moment of a perfect storm, but with so many pre-existing issues in the sector. My final slide. So if we go, if we look closer at the participants' perceptions, and through that lens of EU student numbers, diversity and competition, so it could be different if we look at research, for example, but through that theme of EU student numbers, Brexit has revealed, magnified and accentuated existing issues in the sector, while also motivated consideration of the future around identity, mission, purpose, and the relationships between universities, policy, and communities. So thank you for listening.
And thank you, Vassiliki. You've taken us through some pretty important issues. Brexit has been a kind of prism in the UK. It's broken down components of the country into clearer light. And but the data which you're speaking to, which of course I was also engaged in collecting, was 2017, 2018 data. And things have changed a bit, I guess. The overwhelming messages we got when we collected those data were feelings of loss and regret. The people we interviewed were overwhelmingly committed to their relationships with non-UK EU students, benefited greatly in their own eyes from those associations, saw this as very good for UK students in the classroom and good for the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the campus. And I must say that, how enriching it was when we had free movement in general, that people from the rest of Europe moving through the UK freely, and how exciting that often was in many respects. And of course, there's every reason to be concerned about that ease of movement's diminished. And to the extent to which that becomes then a cutting off process in a permanent way is another question, though. It may not, in fact, lead to this fundamental demographic disengagement. You may well find that over time we are able to restore some of the lost student flow. What do you think about the long-term prospect? Is the UK going to, you think, make the make the worst of it and say, well, that's changed. We're no longer part of Europe in any respect. We're no longer focusing on that engagement with Europe and European students, or will it lead to, you think, some restoration of the pre-Brexit position over time?
Well, I can sort of look at the data and say that we had both views. We had the more optimistic together with the more pessimistic view, and it's quite difficult to know what lies in the future. I think certainly for those students who experience a transition, that there is a very strong disincentive. You had all those rights, the security, and not only the security, but also that being feeling that you are welcomed. And all of a sudden, I think for those students, it's quite the change can be abrupt, Younger generations, those who are now, I don't know, maybe 12, 13, and they grow and they know that the UK is no longer part of the EU, might have a very different experience. So I think it's very much how also we felt it as EU citizens in the UK. I mean, you have signed up to something that was different to what you have right now. And I think for those people who experience all those transitions, it's probably, I think things are not going to take off very quickly. Maybe, so in the short to medium term, I think that the downward trend might continue. Then for the younger students, 5-10 years down the line is difficult to predict. I don't know what sort of views of the world they will have.
Now we've got several people coming into the Q&A in the chat already. Let me read a question for Nick Hillman. He's on a train and has intermittent loss of connection, so he'd like me to read his question out. Now he said that some of the comments from the participants in the study about the financial impact on universities seem rather naive, given that UK universities often make a loss on students in the home funding system, and that was the rate at which EU students were paying, of course. And of course, the EU students of the future will pay much higher fees. So there may be cases where, as you said in your presentation, that in the future we'll see an increase rather than a decrease in actual revenue. Did you want to comment on that, Vassiliki?
Yes, I think the question of revenues, we didn't, the sense that we had was overall, institutionally speaking, people didn't say, there is a problem. There was, I think the issue was more felt closer to academic units, where if you have a program that has 50% of EU students, what do you do? And there were these casual notions, oh, we have people who are teaching European law, or well, they will do something else. Or there will be some natural sort of flow within the system. So I think they were very cautious and they didn't want to touch on issues of restructuring, the departments, staff losses, or what you will need to do when you will have subject areas where there will not be enough student interest. But I think we didn't have a lot of information around finances, and what we received were rather sort of easy calculations, 50% fewer students, they pay double the fee. So that was kind of as sophisticated as we got it at that time. It's also important to say that the Home Office had commissioned a report, an econometric based econometric study that had looked at a number of variables with that very sort of characteristic precision of those studies, and they had and that was commissioned in 2018, and they predicted that only two institutions, only Oxford and Cambridge, would gain from the change of fees, and all the other institutions will have a loss. And that report was only published in 2021. So February 2021, when it was commissioned in 2018. And I don't think that our participants had this information at hand. And from what we gathered, they hadn't really, because there was so much uncertainty, they didn't think it was wise to spend additional institutional resource in making predictions or trying to calculate exactly what will happen. But yes, the calculations, finances, we didn't get very sophisticated information. So I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was only 15 to 24 months after the referendum. So this is quite early in the process. Now, can I bring in King Alexander at this point? King.
Yes, hello, thank you for your presentation. I find it very interesting because so much of the additional revenues that have gone to expanded access in England and Britain, really on the backs of international students since 1992. So I'm thinking about the revenue. I'm thinking about the revenue issue. And I think your answer was a very fair answer, that nobody has really calculated the fiscal challenge that they're going to be facing when anticipated student enrollment doesn't show up. So I think your answer was a great answer, that they haven't even begun to address this issue. And I think it's going to be a much bigger problem, particularly for English universities that have become so reliant on fees.
If I could add here, it was remarkable to see that universities weren't monitoring EU numbers. They didn't know, I mean, the data, they had data, but they weren't monitoring numbers. So it was only when we only had one institution where they said, we started looking at EU student enrollments in more detail, only when Brexit was mooted, and they were very surprised when their vice chancellor told them, we've got to look at the split, you know, which countries, where they're coming from. And before that, there wasn't an impetus. So universities started taking stock of their EU students and their EU involvement when the referendum happened.
I'd like to bring in Begona Daransoro at this point. Begona.
You can
Hello?
hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for the interesting presentation. And my question is just the contrary, because I'm interested in being a postdoc as a US student. And because even pre-Brexit, I know that my pathway, both in academy and out of the academy, is quite inter and transdisciplinary one. And it's much more welcome in some UK universities than in other places like Spain or Portugal, where I am now. So my question is, with these Brexit, post-Brexit conditions and uncertainties, how can now a postdoc EU student be more attractive for a UK institution right now? Thank you.
I think I should ask you. You probably know more than I do about that. I mean, we did see that broader concern when people spoke about those overlapping effects and compounding, how the fact that it's going to have on academic environments. And this is what an academic environment is, that, for example, you get some research money, you have a dynamic work environment, you can recruit more researchers, you can recruit more postdocs, and that's something that feeds sort of, there is that effect that everything contributes to that sort of a sense of having a dynamic, a great academic environment. And they felt that there is a disruption there, and there will be a disruption there. So it is, I understand that this is what I said earlier. I think for people who can refer to what was happening a few years ago, when they could potentially come to the UK without all these uncertainties, the visa hassles, and what will happen to research funding. Because what we also know, we know that UK's EU research leadership diminished in the period that we had from the referendum up to now. So the effects are going to be, we know funding goes for 3-4 years, so maybe there have been, there was ongoing funding, but I think that will be felt at some point, and by the time they pick pace again. So I haven't, but right now I did focus only on EU students, and I said we had 50,000 words, so it was quite a considerable amount of data that I've been trying to make sense of. And it's already, I think why I started there was because in January we already had the first UCAS data saying, oh, well, actually, we have 50% of drop. And somebody could say, well, that's due to COVID. But then we had the growth in international student numbers. So it can't be, if COVID had affected equally both, we would have seen some similarities. So international students numbers are increasing, whereas we had, I think we're expecting 50% drop of EU students.
Well, I think
So,
this COVID-19's really sort of sorted things out a bit, hasn't it?
yes.
Because what we've seen is that the demand from the rest of the world outside Europe for UK higher education is very great. And like the US, you know, it's a cut above the demand for even the other English-speaking countries, let alone the rest of the world. There's a sort of this, you know, some people say it's the white supremacy factor. Some people say it's the hegemonic imperial Anglo-American powers in the world. Some people say the English language has authority, you know, but it continues to compel, you know, tremendous demand from the rest of the world, but not in Europe. It's not the same. No. It's more price sensitive in Europe. People have got more options, I think, locally in terms of other European countries that are good to enter, so on and so on. So you've got a different pattern in relation to EU students as compared to, say, South and East Asia, perhaps Africa and South Asia, where the demand seems very high and continues to be, you know, growth inducing in the UK. So this has been very interesting. This is not simply reducible to a commercial market here. You know, these are cultural differences between different regions in the world. And this, you know, is something quite significant about all of that. Now, I'd like to bring in Peter Scott at this point, please. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Vassiliki. That was a great presentation. I wanted to ask about whether the research picked up any issues about whether the recruitment of EU students had allowed provision capacity to be maintained in UK universities that otherwise might have been seen as quite vulnerable, simply because there wasn't enough kind of UK demand for that. And I'm thinking particularly at postgraduate level. I mean, of course, there are lots of strong kind of cultural and idealistic arguments about intellectual diversity and openness, but sometimes there are just very practical managerial ones that if, depending on how many students you could recruit to a course, it's maintained capacity, which otherwise might have gone to the wall, particularly at postgraduate level, but of course that feeds then into a pipeline of kind of doctoral students, postdocs, you know, early career researchers and senior academics, of course, of which there are very many in UK universities. So it might ultimately kind of begin to choke off that pipeline. Were there any ideas like that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, Peter. This is a great question. I think, generally speaking, we had, I was slightly disappointed that people did not expand on the consequences for subject diversity and for the provision, you know, having a comprehensive provision and what will happen to academic fields. So there wasn't that. However, having said that, we had several participants, mostly directors of heads of department or those who had a faculty role. So those for whom, you know, a subject area or a set of disciplines were still important in their discussions. And yes, people did say that, it was in one of my slides, they did say that the fact that we had in some subjects, you would have half of the cohort being EU students. So what will happen to those areas? And there was very much a regret about the academic, you know, the intellectual content being lost. It was always framed through students. So this is going to be such a shame. That means that home students won't have access to those wonderful courses. So there wasn't a recognition of the intellectual, you know, the academic value of the different courses, but it was always framed through home students are no longer going to have access to those courses. There we won't be able to sustain them. And it was also, well, that is also going to impact international students because these programs were also attracting international students. So that was the angle that was through which people spoke about the threat to different programs not being sustainable after Brexit.
Thanks, Vassiliki, and thanks, Peter. I'm going to now bring in our 4 remaining questioners, Vassiliki. So take some notes as you hear them. Remember the first couple when you've heard the 4th one. So we'll start with Paolo Contreras. Welcome back, Paolo, after your participation in the previous webinar. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, really very interesting. I would like to touch a little bit more on the issue of, the great importance that was placed on the issue of diversity on campus, because there is, of course, it's not unexpected. Of course, it's something that can be easily seen and heard, as you mentioned, but there is also quite a sizable amount of research showing that international students and international faculty in the UK usually feel undervalued, or at least they feel that their contribution as an international student and so on is not fully used within the academia. So beyond their concern about lack of diversity, did any of the participants report any concrete actions to make the most of the diversity they already have, whether it's coming from the EU or other countries?
Okay, so hold that question in your mind, Vassiliki. Our next question is from C. Sanger, please. Can you come in? Hello, C. Sanger. I did notify you in the chat, but you didn't respond, so perhaps you didn't pick up my message. In that case, we might go to Ayub Patel, please. Ayub, can you come in? I'm not doing very well today. I think, Olga, you're going to get your question in now. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Olga,
thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I have a question whether the leaders you interviewed reflected on this opportunity as crisis as opportunity to radically reimagine how higher education is funded in England. Something like demarketization opportunity is now, rather than looking to other new markets or emerging markets. Just curious, kind of a blue sky question, I know, but
yes. So great questions. Thank you very much for both. Starting with the diversity, it was surprising that the difference EU students were framed using that vocabulary, because we know that traditionally it's about underrepresented, probably socially disadvantaged students. So there was that concept was stretched to accommodate something that they couldn't really talk, in a very articulate way about. So this is what happens when you have policies, concepts that circulate. They get picked up, they get stretched. So they put EU students inside that diversity. So what do they make of their existing diversity? There wasn't a lot of elaboration, I would say. They only spoke in terms of diversity that enriches us, that enriches, this is what the university is about. So there wasn't, there was rather an affirmation, EU students do contribute, but not so many existing examples. Maybe I want to pick just one. They spoke about quality students. And I think that could be also, they were keen to highlight that EU students are academically able students, that students who sort of embrace the opportunities that the campus is offering. It's not only the courses, they take part in so many things that are going on, and they're an active part of societies, of universities, of communities, and they spoke about quality, and that makes me sometimes reflect as if that was a comment, as if when you have diversity there is a risk to quality. And I think there was some notion that when you're going to take diverse students, there is a risk of retention, that they were keen to come and say, well, with EU students, that's not the case. They're excellent students. Was that a crisis that, you know, they have embraced in a way that helps them reimagine? No, I don't think so. I think there were moments when our participants were really depressed, you know, in those discussions. And the moment when they picked up was, oh, of course we have strategies, you know, we're not that vulnerable. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. So immediately the competitive nerve sort of woke them up again, and they started saying how you know, how they will be responding through recruitment machineries that they're going to deploy, trying to understand, you know, EU student preferences. It was again the branding and recruitment discourse. Was something else that I wanted to say, which I probably looked at the time and forgot. So there wasn't any radical. I think what there was there that sometimes gives me a bit of hope. There was some slight, I would say, slight questioning that had some social justice, global justice connotations. And I think that reordering of borders and of membership, who is part, you know, who is part of that membership? The membership is changing. We're no longer, so all these modifications of membership started, people started questioning about who's higher education for, you know. So there was that social justice approach that I want to bring in and work a little bit in more detail. That's probably the only thing that gives me a bit of hope, I would say, but that's just my interpretation.
Thanks, Vassiliki and Olga, and also Paola. The thing that I think that many of us feel is this quality of the EU students was very high. Those that we taught at master's and doctoral level, and the loss of that flow, or part of that flow, is a significant subtraction from the intellectual, you know, ballast of the UK, and that was shown, of course, in the pattern of academic appointments, where in the, you know, the 5 years previous to the referendum in 2016, or so I was told at the Russell Group when I talked to them about Brexit just after the referendum, the almost half of all new academic appointments had been non-UK EU citizens, almost half. That was the talent flow that was coming into the British universities. And I mean, perhaps it's an issue though about subtraction from, you know, the rest of Europe, and Britain taking in too much of the intellectual action in some ways. It was a bit of a worry, a bit like what the US does at a world level. But, you know, the loss of that flow suddenly, at least the extent that it existed before, is a big loss. However, there are other strong centres in Europe. So what you would like to see would be a situation where British students are engaging more in Europe again. And that's something to really work on, I think, in the next few years, because that in the end will develop reciprocal relationships as well. I'm going to ask you, because I've got we go over time usually, and we usually stop around about now, but Ayub Patel did ask a good question, and I think we should address it. So I'll read the question from the chat. The challenges you highlight point to the reputational hazards involved with the process of leaving the EU. Although we, meaning the UK, have now left the EU and Erasmus, how do you think the global Britain agenda can play a part in convincing the EU and the rest of the world that the UK is not inward-looking? And where do you think the UK government should focus some of its resources and efforts if it decides to take this proactive stance? What's your suggestion for the policymakers?
My suggestion is not to create further hierarchies. This is what has been happening with this global agenda. There is almost as if we're creating sort of a hierarchical value, and we say, oh, we should be global. Global is better than being European. European is being better than being domestic, but a little bit parochial since. So I think there was a competition, and we saw that also in the minds of the participants. So it is, if you present something as a kind of higher, a better, a more legitimate approach, I think that creates some unnecessary competition. And I'm very much a person who, has a plural view of the world. So I feel uncomfortable with those comparisons where they say, well, actually, now we are more outward looking because we're going to embrace that global outlook, and being European was being a bit parochial. So I don't know what will happen. I think that there will be, time is needed for some sort of engagement with the outside world, but also in a way that questions, okay, when we take on board this global international agenda, what are the effects that are being produced? And I'm not sure we are seeing that questioning around internationalization and global justice. So I think that agenda around internationalization has to be tackled also with a responsibility of what is that it is being produced. And I think it would be, from my point of view, it would be more genuine if there is no competition between the European, the international, and whatever other dimensions we find in visions and activities.
I mean, I think, our colleague Susan Robinson is quite rightly pointing to the imperial resonances in global Britain, and that, of course, is, was the underpinning feature of the referendum itself and the exit from the EU. But these big changes, they do constitute a question of where you go from there. And I don't think that's clear in the UK at all in general, or in relation to the higher education sector and its relationship with the rest of the world. And this is a chance to reset things. And you'd hope that an important part of that resetting would be a return to Europe fully and embracing European higher education fully in the way which we did successfully previously. But we also have the opportunity to address the colonial legacy as well. And maybe the attitude to Europe was influenced by that too, and that way of thinking about the world. And we could relate more successfully to Europe, even as a non-member of the EU, if we're able to discard the colonial legacy. So I think the colonial legacy remains, the big issue in the UK. And we had eight webinars, 4 weeks of webinars on decolonisation and racism in global higher education, which was attended by enormous crowds. We had averaged about 130 people. And I think there's a lot of appetite for rethinking these issues in the UK, and for those outside the UK, for rethinking the UK's position in the world as well, which I think we need. I think we need that kind of external reflexivity feeding in. But I want to thank you very sincerely. I think you did really well today in opening up these issues. The conversation in the chat has been very lively, and people are really appreciative of the way you've gone about it today, the modest and informative way which you opened up all of the issues for us. So come back again, Vassiliki, present again on this topic. Thank you very much for what you did today. Our next webinar, which is, of course, next Tuesday, we have Lin Tian, who's currently at Hunan University, was previously at Shanghai Jiaotong in China, a CG researcher, and she's going to be presenting on the globalization aspect of the mission of the leading research universities, how that has become, globalization and the leading research university category have become tied together. And she's going to deal with that empirically through a good qualitative data set. So we look forward to talking with Lynn on Tuesday. We look forward to seeing you all back again, we hope. And most of all, again, thank you, Vassiliki. Bye for now. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.